Good evening and welcome to ACL Update number 3. My name's Alister Cameron. I'm one of the national directors here at the Australian Christian Lobby, and I'm here with the wonderful Wendy Francis, National Director for Politics at the Australian Christian Lobby. Welcome this evening, Wendy.
Thanks for having me again, Alister.
Great to have you. I just wanted to start tonight just with a reflection. John chapter 18, and Jesus is talking to Pontius Pilate. And in that conversation, Pilate stops at one moment, at a really critical moment, and says, "What is truth?" Interestingly enough, Jesus has just basically said to him that my followers who are in truth listen to me. Now, what Jesus is hinting at, not unsubtly, is that he is the truth. Elsewhere, Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And so Pilate comes back and says, "What is truth?" And there's something deliciously, dreadfully ironic, I think that is the right word to use in that moment, where Pontius Pilate, unawares, is speaking directly to the Lord himself. He is speaking to truth embodied right there. And here he is saying, "What is truth?" And of course, it's like a children's pantomime. "You're looking at him!" But of course, we don't say that. And I'm sorry if I just blew the microphone out. And I just want to challenge us over this Christmas period as we're thinking, and we're not that far away, actually, from New Year's resolution time. And I always start thinking early about New Year's resolutions because I need more time to rev up to those things than you do. I'm just more fleshy, probably, and I just need more time to prepare myself. And the New Year's resolution here, I'm encouraging you, marinade deeply in the Word. You know, we have the audacity, Martin Isles, our managing director, the audacity to call his program The Truth of It. Now, he's not saying that he's the font of all truth. What he's saying is that if he marinades in the Word, he can have a confidence in the presence and the power of the Spirit to illuminate truth from Scripture, which is God's inspired Word. And we're saying that too. If there's anything that we can bring you most weeks here at the ACL, it's that we are coming to the public square, marinating in God's Word by the power of the Spirit and bringing that to you, knowing that Jesus is the fullness of God's Word. So at this Christmas season, as you're thinking about New Year's resolutions, I would encourage you, think about what can you do, and I'm challenging myself as well, what patterns of behavior, what allocations of time will allow me to marinate deeply in the Word of God. You know, there's an old story which I've heard, and I'll believe it's not apocryphal, which is that when bank tellers back in the day, and I don't know if it's still true, when it was all cash, they were taught, this is how they were taught to know a fake banknote from a real one. They weren't. That's the punchline. They weren't taught. Instead, they spent oodles of time with the real deal, so that when the fake came along, they could immediately tell. So the best training for knowing lie from truth is to spend a great deal of time intimately with the truth. It works for banknotes and it works for God's truth as well. So my encouragement as we come into this Christmas season and travel through it like lightning and get into New Year's resolutions is set your heart apart before the Lord, consecrate yourself again, and ask him, what can I do to marinate more deeply in the truth this year? And we as the ACL will commit, as we ever do, to fighting for that truth with you and to bringing that to you in as great a clarity as we can. So there's my little message, Wendy, to start us off tonight.
Well, it's a
we are also
to me
delighted.
As well, can I say? Whew.
Okay.
Yeah.
I did. I received that with conviction this morning. I'll tell you that.
Thank you.
We also have with us, and we're very pleased to have John Steenhof, who is the principal lawyer at the Human Rights Law Alliance. Those of you with a bit of history may recall that the ACL originally started the HRLA, but it has well and truly blossomed into its own thing under John's leadership. John, I think it's fair to say the HRLA and you yourself spend 100% of your time focused on cases of religious discrimination and of law related to people's liberties. And so it is fitting that you should be with us this evening to talk about these two pieces of legislation, and we'll start with these that have gone through. The first one that I just want to touch on before we really focus on the Religious Discrimination Bill, which is a federal piece, is the Victorian Religious Exceptions Bill. It passed 22-12 this last week, this last sitting week of the year, with obviously what you would normally expect is some opportunities for discussion. That didn't really happen. 22-12 with no amendments. Would we describe that as disappointing, John?
Uh, Thanks, Alister. A pleasure to be here. And yes, the progress of this bill being rammed through the Victorian Parliament with little or no consideration is deeply, deeply disappointing. There is no question that legislation like this, which fundamentally changes the balance in law between the protections given to Christian schools in relation to the ethos and ensuring that that protection also accommodates a pluralistic society, that those things take time, they need consideration, and they need input from all sides, and that just hasn't happened. This is a purely ideological piece of legislation. It has been rammed through with unnecessary speed and without consideration, and it's going to be for the detriment not only of our Christian schools, but also any religious organisation.
So for those who are late to the party, what will it do fundamentally? What is it changing? What is it allowing?
So the tagline for the bill and the reason for it being pushed through Parliament was to try to remove the ability of schools to fire gay teachers, to expel gay students. There was this preoccupation with the idea that Christian schools had a free ride to discriminate. That was terribly unjust and needed to be removed. But what you should realise is that the bill was not put forward by students or by teachers. It's largely an activist vehicle to try to make Christian schools and Christian organisations open season for people who are hostile to Christian religion and who are hostile to the ethos of those schools. So what's the bill going to do? It's going to interfere with the ability of religious organisations to hire people who are consistent with their ethos. It's going to allow courts to intrude into the doctrines of religious organisations and the doctrines of schools to determine whether or not the way that those doctrines are applied is reasonable and proportionate. In short,
But John, can I just ask then, are we effectively saying we're putting theology onto lawyers? We're asking lawyers to think theologically, to make judgments where it's possibly reasonable for a Christian institution on a theological grounds to think a thing or to operate accordingly or not? Are we saying we'll let secular judges make those calls?
Absolutely. And that is one of the real shortcomings of a lot of the legal propositions in this space, federally, at state level and territory level, is that it is putting the courts in the place of theologians to decide internally what organisations, what churches, what schools believe. And judges are ill-equipped to be theologians. Most of them haven't seen the inside of a church building for quite some time, and most of them are out of touch with the real on-the-ground experience of religious people in Australia. So that means that when you, as a practical matter, you're running these cases, you are at the behest of these judges, and it's a real lottery of outcomes. But the worst thing is that it opens up our schools, our organisations, to activists and to their claims of discrimination, to use the legislation which is there to protect people from unfair treatment, to then use it as a weapon against these organisations. And you've seen a very coordinated campaign to try to get rid of these protections for schools, for churches, for organisations, so that the activists can get in, and we don't want that. Some of the additional dangers of this bill is that it's now going to tie funding to non-discrimination. So it's going to provide that wherever there is any sort of government funding involved, then there is no protection against discrimination complaints for religious organisations. And it's really going to be a weapon of coercion, particularly against Christian schools. And the logic behind it is just completely flawed. There is no money that is the government's. All money the government gets is money of its citizens. And many of those citizens have decided we don't want our children being raised under the individualistic and selfish values and sex-obsessed values that plague our public schools. We want them in a place that's teaching them virtues. Those citizens have chosen to put them in a Christian school, and those citizens should have their wishes given some weight when it comes to applying the money that they've given to the government. There's no way the government can impose its values through funding on a significant proportion of the population. I think it's 1 in 3 people send their children to a private school for good reason. Well, their tax money should be able to go towards that without the government holding on to the purse strings, depending on whether or not you meet their elitist values. So
now, Wendy, thank you, John. Now, Wendy, as far as Victoria is concerned, this seems to go to pattern, really, doesn't it? It shouldn't be an enormous surprise to Victorians in view of gender conversion bills and other things that have been our experience recently. All the more reason why, from our perspective, a religious discrimination bill applied at federal level should, we hope, have some capacity to address overreach at state level.
That's exactly right, and that's one of the reasons why the religious discrimination bill federally is so important. It's the passage of this bill in Victoria, and as you say, it does run to a particular pattern, particularly in Victoria.
So the religious discrimination bill, let's talk about that. It's been pushed into the new year. That could be a good thing in terms of the rigours of going to a committee, or it could be death by 1,000 cuts. I'm not really sure how we want to look at that. John, just bring us up to speed on what it actually means that it has been pushed into the new year. Is that a good thing or not? Because there are people saying there is no way we're getting any religious discrimination legislation through by this government, with only 2 sitting weeks, I'm told, in the next calendar year ahead of budget and therefore necessarily an election coming pretty quickly afterwards. What are the chances that we'll get a religious discrimination bill from this government? And is there anything good to have it pushed forward in the way that it has?
Yeah, thanks, Alister. It's a difficult question. There can be lots of crystal ball gazing and lots of variables in determining whether legislation will get through or not. I think the percentage chance of it happening are pretty slim at this stage. The legislation was introduced at the 11th hour at the end of the parliamentary sitting schedule. And obviously there was a lot of furor and debate, not just from opposition or crossbench, but also internally within the Liberal Party. That's meant that this bill is facing a lot of headwinds. And now it's been sent not just to one committee, but to 2 committees, a Senate committee and a joint parliamentary committee, both of which will be receiving submissions from interested parties by the 21st of December. And I believe that they report back in early February. Is this a good thing? Well, I think it's something that's happening because people want to provide this bill with more scrutiny and are suspicious of something being rammed through at the end of the legislative program of this government that's had the ability to do it for the last 3 years and has waited until now to do it.
So it does seem like it's a too hard basket kind of a scenario. It's like the government sort of knows that that's something that they want to do, but it's become very complicated.
Well, a lot of what's complicating it is just the hostility and the politics that's being played with this issue of religious freedom. The bill itself is actually a fairly unremarkable piece of legislation. And all it does is bring religious belief and its protection into line with the protection that other attributes like sex, like age, like disability have had for a long time under federal law. So it's not doing anything mind-blowing. It's not pushing religious freedom ahead in a significant way. It's a very small, incremental change, but it really has the activists' backs up. And there is a concerted campaign to kill it, which has been full of scaremongering and misinformation, and which has, I think, made the government a little gun-shy about how politically they can achieve this small change.
And look, I'm just looking at a document that was prepared by your good self and some others sort of addressing some of the mythology around here, that the bill is unnecessary, that the bill allows religious schools to fire gay teachers or expel gay students. It seems to me that a number of edge cases have come up. I read the other day of the fear that Catholic schools would suddenly fire single-parent teachers.
Yeah.
Is there any truth in that?
No, it's all of those concerns are a complete narrative that's been built on nonsense. If you look at the actual provisions of the bill, there is no way that schools are going to be able to go on some massive firing campaign as a result of the Religious Discrimination Bill. There's no way that ordinary religious people are going to be able to go around with impunity delivering fire and brimstone sermons against anyone that they meet on the street or who they meet in their employment. All of that is complete nonsense. And there's been a particular preoccupation with anything involving homosexuality, gay teachers, gay students, or gender, transgender people and who are vulnerable being subjected to unfair treatment. All of those attributes are protected under the Sex Discrimination Act. This bill is not changing that act in any way, shape, or form. Most of the protections in this act and the balancing clauses relate to the attribute of religious belief only. So where the bill provides that a religious school, for instance, can preference people of its own religion, what it's doing is making sure that you can prefer someone of your own religion as compared to someone of a different religion, which is completely banal, completely expected, and is a usual part of these kinds of discrimination statutes. Yet it has raised an unbelievable amount of noise in the press as they keep on generating these hypotheticals, which will never happen, about things that are going to be able to be done if the bill becomes law.
And I don't think it's desperately uncontroversial. I don't think it's desperately controversial to say that in this sort of modern woke movement, there is a totalizing, there is a sort of totalitarian instinct, if I dare use that word, which will not tolerate any opposition. So that in normal political negotiations, there is give and there is take, but not from the woke mob. Any compromise, any negotiation is a terrible defeat. There is an assumption that they must have everything, and that any compromise. So I feel like it's not wrong to say there's been a lot of lying going on. They've just fabricated nonsense to try and demonize something which, as you say, is fairly unremarkable.
I think there's a combination of narratives that had already been set before anyone had seen the bill that were going to come out regardless of what the bill said.
There we are.
A combination of the scare tactics that have worked so well in the past, we'll use them again, and a combination of misreading of the bill, so that people read the bill and on its face they think it says something, they ignore the qualifications and the limitations that are put in the bill, which are very, very balanced. In fact, I think they remove a lot of the usefulness of even those provisions. But people haven't read them, so they go with their immediate response, their knee-jerk reaction to what they've read. So all of those things combine with each other to provide a scaremongering campaign against this bill, and it's really stalled the bill as it's been introduced, and that's been very disappointing.
Now, Wendy, on the positive side, this bill actually does have some positives that will actually legitimately protect people, provide some protections from discrimination. We've had some stories. We had someone banned from a cafe for reading the Bible and praying. We had a teacher who almost lost his job for expressing his religious beliefs. We had someone fired for posting on social media. We've had a number of examples, and indeed, John, you have a website that is kind of collecting all those narratives. So we can do narrative too, people. We can tell stories, but these are substantive stories. They are reflections of a lack of adequate legals. And as you rightly point out, it's really just it's just bringing us into line. It's kind of addressing gaps in legislation that should never have been there.
Yeah, it's not only just bringing us into line; it's actually doing what the Human Rights Committee, the UN Human Rights Committee, has been calling on us to do for many years. So, in 2017, there was a review of Australia's human rights, and the UN Human Rights Committee actually expressed concern back then that we had no protection against discrimination for religion. And, I think it's good for our people to know just some of those basic things that they can say in rebuttal to other people in a very kind way. It's just good to point out, do you know that in New South Wales and South Australia at the moment, somebody could put up a sign outside their restaurant saying no Christians allowed, and that is actually not breaking the law in those states. We have some really basic freedoms that are actually being trampled on as far as a religious person goes in Australia that need to be fixed by this bill. 70%, or it was like 69.5 or something % of people in the previous census, the only census results that we actually have at the moment, identified as being religious in Australia. So we've got 70% of people identifying as being religious, and yet they have no protection for that attribute. The McCrindle did some research recently, and 29% of people who identify as religious say that they have been discriminated on the basis of being religious. So there is a great need for this bill. It certainly, as John has said, it doesn't give anybody the right to speak without consequence. It doesn't allow workplace bullying. It doesn't override any code of conduct that's already there. It doesn't affect the other discrimination bills that are already there. This is purely to provide freedom of religion for Australians.
Great, and it's important to point out, that is the substance of this. Those exercises in creative writing which emerge in mainstream media to make the case for absurd edge cases, which are basically not real, needed to be respected for what they are, and that's sort of the lay of the land. Any final thoughts on that, John?
Sure. I guess what we've been trying to do is get the narratives out there of the real stories of religious discrimination, rather than people being focused on the hypotheticals, ridiculous hypotheticals that are out there. But what it's exhibiting to me is the uncomfortable nature of this discussion, where we are trying to establish robust pluralism, where people can believe fundamentally different things about who we are, what our purpose in life is, and how we are to operate within our communities, while also allowing us to live in a peacefulness with each other and in harmony with each other in this society. As we discuss this religious discrimination bill, it's pretty clear that there are certain attributes that the elites and those who are campaigning against the bill want us to absolutely have to accept. And your comment about this being an all-totalizing system is very true. There's not a comfortability with that plurality where Christians can believe and teach, and parents can exercise their fundamental rights to educate their children in accordance with their virtues. There's a set of overriding virtues, a meta-narrative that everyone is now being told they must comply with and accede to, and a religious freedom bill must also be suborned to that, to modern concepts, particularly of sexual orientation and gender identity. Yes. That's where the threat is. So hopefully we see a pushback towards a confident pluralism.
That's it. And people of faith need to know that, but actually every Australian needs to know that part of what we celebrate in Australia is a rigorous democracy, a rigorous pluralism, and that in fact this sort of woke instinct, this woke movement, I'm not even sure what language to use, critical theory dressed up in 1,000 different ways, it is a threat to that pluralism which allows us all to experience the freedom that a healthy democracy is meant to provide. I think that's a reasonable analysis. John Steenhof, principal lawyer at HRLA, thank you so much for your time with us today.
Thanks, Alister. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks, John.
Always good talking to John, who's just a font of knowledge on all these things. Now, Wendy, we'll keep going. The Victorian Pandemic Management Bill. Let's just get this out of the way. Let's just solve the Victorian.
I wish we could have gotten it out of the way. Point. Yeah, I wish we could have.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, it did eventually pass 18 to 20 with the help of independent MLC Rob Barton from the Transport Matters Party. We're still sort of analysing all of what was involved in that. Just bring us up to speed on what happened there and what it might mean.
So it did hit a roadblock, and that was good, because what's happened is that the original legislation has seen some amendments go through. The original legislation would have seen Well, it's already unprecedented powers, I think, being given to the Premier and to the Health Minister, but the original one would have been unbelievable. So we now have a bill that grants sweeping powers. We still have that to the Premier and Health Minister. They can declare a pandemic, even if there's no cases of COVID. That was what they were wanting, even if there was no cases. This is without the advice of the chief health officer. They can declare a health emergency, and they can lock down the state for even up to 3-month blocks as often as he likes. Victorians can be jailed for 2 years for breaching public health orders, and the fine has been reduced from what they wanted, but it's still over $42,000, the fine for breaching these health orders. And, we're seeing mass...
It's huge.
It is huge. We're seeing mass public protests in Melbourne at the same time. But, this is a worrying trend in Victoria. And it is a worrying trend right across all sort of legislative fields, but this one has just taken so many people by surprise. Not even surprise, I think shock, that in Australia we would have given this sort of power to 2 people.
Yes, and you make that point that we're talking ostensibly about a health concern where the Premier can make quite sweeping statements and initiate some quite powerful legal injunctions, emergency orders, as I understand it, without direct consultation to a chief health officer.
He wanted more power. So he wanted the power to actually differentiate even between groups of people. So he could actually segregate between groups of people. That was denied in the amendments as well. So there has been amendments that have gone through, but this is still a very worrying development.
Yeah, yes, indeed. All right, well, this is not core business for the ACL talking about pandemic management bills, but it really does, as you say, it goes to pattern. It shows something of the spirit of what's going on in Victoria. We'll keep watching this space. Protests certainly are continuing. We're not sure what fruit they can necessarily bear in the current form of things. But yeah.
And I think we've said this before, but I think it's really important to say that these protesters, so many people, we're not talking about anti-vaxxers here. We're not talking about a fringe people. We're talking about people who are worried about maintaining freedom in Australia. So I get upset when the media calls them anti-vaxxers because I don't believe that's the case.
And I've been delighted to see articles emerging in the ABC, on The Age, various networks, beginning to speak a little bit more circumspectly, a bit more thoughtfully, a bit more roundedly around the topic, beginning to challenge the logic of endless locking down of unvaccinated, of a 2-tier apartheid system, if you want to call it that. I think the hard crust is cracking, and I think there is a sort of a questioning beginning to emerge, even in the sort of more left-flavoured, typically very faithful to Dan Andrews media, and I think that has to happen. I think anything else is utterly disingenuous and a failure of journalism. So that's good to see, and let's see what happens there.
It is a testament to people power again, and we say this often on these sort of these interviews, but people power really does make a difference.
Yes, and if there is a totalitarian instinct, let's go back to that word, but if there is a totalitarian instinct, the one thing you cannot do is surrender to it. Because surrender is considered compliance. It's considered consent. The only way to not give consent is to continue to find ways to express opposition, to speak the truth in public, in various ways. All right, let's move on. And look, the theme behind all of this is it hasn't been the greatest week for the sort of victories that we want. There are some silver linings, and we will get to those. But let's just keep going here. Northern Territory, the abortion to birth bill, Wendy, has passed, and let's be clear: this means viable, healthy babies up to and including the day of full term and ostensibly delivery, even for reasons of sex selection, can be aborted. That on its face is barbaric. I think that is the word that George Christensen used last week in reference to the purposes behind his Babies Born Alive bill. I think barbaric is the right word. Just tease out for us what happened in the Northern Territory there.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to note. Some of the speeches were deeply disappointing. Is too easy a word. They were distressing because they were talking about that they need late-term abortion so that disabilities can be detected late into the pregnancy and abortion can occur. And I can only imagine how distressing that would be for any Australian who has a disability. Because what is the message there? I mean, the inevitable end of that argument is that many people with disabilities should not have been born. Is that really what the Speaker was saying in that case? And these are the speeches that are happening in preparation for this bill going through. The other thing that I really want to say is that the process in the Parliament in the Northern Territory was atrocious. So what happened is that members, and they're saying that it was a mistake, they're saying that it was an oversight, but members were actually denied any opportunity to state their position or to actually even move amendments on this bill. It was a division was not given, and we can explain that perhaps in a later interview when we talk about political processes. That would be a good thing. But there was they're saying that there was a procedural blunder, and the Northern Territory News said that there was a number of people, including the Disabilities Minister, who is Kate Warden, who wanted to have the opportunity to either vote against it or to abstain, but she wasn't given that opportunity because there was no division. So there were people who wanted to actually put on Hansard, put on the record that they were opposed to this bill, and they were not given that opportunity. But
so, Wendy, I mean, on the face of it, I would say rubbish. I would say get real. I don't believe that for a second. I've seen enough parliamentary television to know when anything warrants scrutiny. Someone's got their hand up. Point of order, Mr. Speaker, Mrs. Speaker. So what are we to make of that?
We're to make of it that it's an actual farce up there in the Northern Territory Parliament, particularly over this legislation, but we've seen it a number of times, and proper processes are not being followed. And so somehow, there needs to be a call to order, and particularly over something that we're talking about, life and death, and the speeches referring to disabilities in that way, so incredibly offensive. It was an atrocious show of lack of leadership there in the Northern Territory this week.
Yeah. Look, and if anybody's wondering, as the ACL, we ran a campaign. We flooded the Northern Territory with emails. We're very grateful, as we always are, to all of you who participated in that. And at the same time as we don't have the victories that we're looking for at this particular moment, there is something very important about testifying. There is something very important about holding people to account. It's one thing for someone to do something which we disagree with, which we think is flat out evil. But it's another thing for them to have had hundreds and thousands of voices testifying to truth and saying, hey, if you do this, this is bad, this is sin, this is ungodly, this is not right. And the fact that your testimony is out there is really, really important in the eternal scheme of things, frankly.
Absolutely.
That they are held to account.
Absolutely. Your voice was there, speaking truth in public, and that is not to be ignored.
Yeah. And again, legislation, the nature of things, there can be new legislation. So the battle never ends, and we're working, as we always do, towards the next opportunity. All right. Maeve's Law.
Yeah, I think it's Maeve. I say it
Maeve,
but yeah.
Maeve, you're probably right. I'm struggling on that one.
It's named after a little girl who suffers from mitochondrial disease. And the sad thing for me about even the name is that if this law is passed, and if the law had been in place, Maeve wouldn't even be alive. So she would have been one of the young, beautiful children who we would have actually screened out. So that's really sad for me. But this is it's mitochondrial transfer. It is radical genetic manipulation. It has never been allowed in Australia before because it is a scientific experiment.
And it requires a parliamentary ruling to be allowed.
It does.
So it's not a small thing.
No, not at all. Because what we're doing is we're actually creating an embryo with 3 biological parents. So there are 2 genetic biological mothers and 1 father. And this actually crosses a completely new frontier in human experimentation without us knowing what the results are going to be. Even the bill itself sort of talks about that, the long-term side effects are going to need to be monitored of children who are born this, because they say that the end result is uncertain. So we are experimenting with children's lives. We have even existing studies that would reveal a higher rate of abnormal fertilisation in this process. So there's a lot of concern about this. But I think one of the biggest is that we're talking about children being born of 2 biological mothers, 1 biological father, and we have no idea about the psychological or the ethical implications of that, let alone the physical implications of that, and they should not be dismissed lightly. And there's been a number of very top ethicists speaking against this, but it has actually passed the lower house in federal parliament this week. So it has been a disappointing week for us in ACL. But God knows the end result. But we're still pushing for this to be disallowed in the Senate.
Great. So there is still the opportunity. It's passed the lower house in federal parliament, but it'll go to the Senate in the new year. So there's a bit of work that can still be done there. I'm particularly interested in this as a conversation for another time, because we're really running out of time, Wendy. But the relationship between thorny ethical stuff and what happens in Parliament. Because to your example earlier from the Northern Territory, to steamroll through with just a cavalier disregard for the ethical subtleties and nuances, particularly in areas where we've never done it before. I mean, there's probably a really good reason why we've never done it before. And there need to be mechanisms in place to really wrestle with the ethics of things. And I'm not blaming a politician for not being a PhD ethicist, but the law of unintended consequences, I think, needs to scare us, and I think it needs to scare us for really good reasons.
It does seem to me as if the politicians and people who are pushing this are playing God, and that is a fearful thing to do. This mitochondrial transfer is not, it doesn't cure mitochondrial disease. So in the same way as we've seen campaigns, don't screen me out, for children who are born with Down syndrome, we should not be screening people out from being born.
Full stop.
Absolutely. This is what this mitochondrial transfer does is actually it's a genetic manipulation to ensure that people with mitochondrial disease are not born.
That's it. And again, the awful irony, again, I think that's the right use of the word, but the awful fact that if Maeve's law had applied before Maeve, she would never have been.
Absolutely. And she's a loved young girl.
Indeed, absolutely. All right. We're going to conclude this, Wendy. There have been a few wins. One of them was we went up to Parliament House, Sandra on our team, 40,000 signatories to the PM requesting religious protections. You're seeing a little bit of the video of that now. We also, the final Gospels of Luke were distributed, and we asked during that distribution for photos, as many photos as we could get, and I shared it in our first ACL update episode, a few of those, but there's some more coming, and I might throw some on screen now.
And we're hearing some great stories back from the Luke. It's just that campaign has been so incredibly encouraging to us at ACL because the stories are amazing.
Yes, and I actually was reading in our company chat this morning that someone accepted the Lord as their saviour, come into the family of God on the back of that, which is just an extraordinary thing, just a wonderful thing. And then lastly, Giving Tuesday. How did we go on Giving Tuesday?
Yeah, look, this is a fairly new thing for ACL. It's a new thing for Australia, I think. But on Giving Tuesday, one day, our supporters gave over $160,000. And so we were just blown away. And can you imagine, like, it's been a bit of a tough fortnight, to be honest, because it's been so heavy in Parliament with so many things. And then in one day, in one way, the money doesn't matter, but the fact that our supporters would get behind us to that degree, it just, to me, it tells us that they're praying for us. It tells us that they're watching and they're supporting us. And I personally felt huge encouragement. I know everybody on the team did.
Yeah. Indeed. Well, look, folks, I'd love to keep talking. There's so much that I'd love to end on a much stronger positive note, Wendy. It has been a tough week, but we're ever grateful to you, our supporters. We're ever grateful to the Lord for his faithfulness. And these are battles, but these are not the war. We know how the war works. We know how the book ends, and the Lord is faithful. So be encouraged in all of that. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Wendy Francis, thank you again for your time.
Thank you,
and see you
Alister.
next week, everyone.
God bless everyone.